What would you do if someone tried to take away what was rightfully yours? Not with force, but with entitlement. Not by stealing, but by simply believing they were more deserving. 15-year-old Jalen Carter hadn't planned on confronting that question when he boarded flight AC-709. He hadn't expected his first solo journey to turn into a defining moment. All he knew was that he was excited, nervous, but ready. For the first time, he wasn't flying beside his father. For the first time, he was sitting in first class alone. Seat 1A. The coveted front left window seat, the kind of seat seasoned travelers fought for, even if silently. But to Jalen, it wasn't just a seat, it was a gift, a message. His father, Marcus Carter, CEO of Carter Technologies and one of the most respected business leaders in the country, had personally booked the flight. And not just any ticket, he had ensured his son's name was attached to the best seat on the plane. Not to show off, not to make a statement, but because he wanted his son to understand something deeply. You don't need to justify your place to anyone, he had told Jalen the night before. Not when you've earned it. The morning of the flight, Jalen had dressed carefully: navy sweater, pressed jeans, clean white sneakers. Simple but presentable. His backpack was organized, his ticket printed and folded neatly in the side pocket. As he stepped onto the plane, he felt a blend of nerves and pride fluttering in his chest. He had double-checked the seat number more times than he could count. 1A. He didn't want to sit in the wrong place, not today. As he entered the first-class cabin, the flight attendant smiled politely. "Welcome aboard." Jalen returned the smile and moved to his seat, placing his backpack under the seat in front of him before settling in. He ran his fingers along the buttery leather armrest. It was soft, cool, and carried that distinct scent of something rarely touched by chaos. He exhaled slowly. The hum of the engines preparing for takeoff, the soft clicks of passengers placing their carry-ons in the overhead bins, and the subtle scent of citrus from the air freshener calmed him. This was more than luxury. This was an experience, a quiet adult space, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged to it. A flight attendant returned moments later, her smile genuine this time. "Mr. Carter, would you like something to drink before departure?" The title, Mr. Carter, startled him slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, please. Orange juice." As she walked away, Jalen stared out the window, glass of juice now in hand. The sun was beginning its descent beyond the distant mountains, casting soft streaks of amber and violet across the sky. The view felt like a painting, quiet and endless. He smiled. He wasn't thinking about his father's status or what the seat cost. He was thinking about how good it felt to be trusted with independence. But just as he took his first sip, the sound of high heels clicked sharply against the cabin floor. Confident, fast, intentional. Jalen didn't know it yet, but that click, that rhythm of power and privilege, was about to bring a storm straight to seat 1A. And this flight, which had begun with calm skies and fatherly pride, was about to test every ounce of dignity he'd ever been taught to carry. The sound of heels drew closer, measured sharp, unapologetically assertive. It cut through the soft murmurs of boarding passengers like the metallic ring of a gavel in a courtroom. Jalen turned his head slightly, the glass of orange juice now resting in the crook of his palm. She entered like she owned the air. A woman in her mid-50s, elegantly dressed in a cream-colored wool coat that hugged her frame with gold accents at the collar. Her heels were polished to perfection, her makeup flawless. Every strand of honey-blonde hair was immaculately pinned in place. She wasn't just arriving, she was making an entrance. And as her eyes scanned the cabin, narrowing at each seat, they landed predictably on 1A. She stopped, paused. A faint wrinkle formed between her brows. Her lips pursed in displeasure, as though she had spotted something out of place. Like a speck on fine china, like a crack in marble. Then, with an exaggerated sigh that seemed carefully calibrated to draw attention, she turned to a nearby flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, voice cool and clipped. "There must be a mistake." The attendant turned with a courteous smile. "How can I assist you, ma'am?" The woman gestured toward Jalen with a dismissive flick of her manicured fingers. "That's my seat. I always sit in 1A. The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. She glanced down at her tablet fingers, moving swiftly over the screen. "I understand, ma'am, but let me double-check the manifest." Jalen remained seated, straightening his posture slightly. His chest tightened, but he kept his face neutral. He wasn't sure what was happening yet, but he knew instinctively it had something to do with him. According to our records, the attendant said politely, "Seat 1A is assigned to Mr. Jalan Carter." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Who?" she repeated, as though the name were somehow offensive to her ears. "Mr. Carter," the attendant replied calmly. The woman turned her gaze back to Jalan. She studied him now not as a fellow passenger, but as a question. No worse. As a problem, her lips curled into a small, disbelieving smile. "You've got to be joking," she said flatly. Then louder, "There is no way that seat was booked for him. I'm a Platinum Elite member. I have flown this airline for over 15 years. This is my seat on every Friday flight to San Francisco." The attendant offered a tight-lipped smile. "I'm very sorry for the confusion, ma'am, but the system is clear." The woman drew herself up straighter. "Do you know who I am?" Jalan could feel the words vibrating beneath his skin. He lowered his orange juice, gently, carefully, every movement deliberate, as if to signal, "I am not afraid of you, but I will not provoke you either." Inside, a familiar heat began to build. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was recognition. He'd seen this look before on the playground, at school orientation, in waiting rooms. That mixture of disbelief and indignation when someone couldn't reconcile his presence with their expectations. But this time it was public, intentional, and weaponized. The woman turned back to the attendant, her voice now sharp enough to cut glass. "You need to fix this immediately." Before the attendant could respond, Jalan spoke. Calm, measured, like his father would. "Ma'am," he said gently, "this seat was booked for me by my father. I'm sorry if there's been a mix-up, but I'm not moving." The woman's nostrils flared. "You don't understand," she snapped. "This isn't personal. But there are expectations, standards, and I don't care what your father booked. Children don't sit in 1A. The cabin fell quiet. And in that moment, beneath the leather headrest beside the window, painted with gold light, Jalan Carter realized this flight was no longer about takeoff. It was about standing ground at 30,000 feet. The silence that followed was thick, too thick for an airplane cabin. You could almost hear the passengers holding their breath. Some glanced up from behind first-class partitions or paused mid-reach for their seatbelts. No one said anything, but their ears were unmistakably tuned to every word. Jalan sat completely still, his back no longer resting against the seat. He felt the tightness in his shoulders, but refused to show it. His fingers, however, gripped the armrest not in fear, but in containment. His father had always told him, "You don't need to shout to make your presence known. Let them hear your silence." The woman, Evelyn Stokes, as her luggage tag would later reveal, was not done. "I've flown with this airline for decades," she said loudly, making sure every syllable reached its intended audience. "Every crew knows me. Every seat map knows where I sit. I always book 1A. And now some child has taken it." Her eyes flicked back to Jalan with disdain. Unbelievable. The flight attendant cleared her throat and leaned in, voice still kind but now firmer. "Mrs. Stokes, I've verified multiple times. Your seat assignment for this flight is 3C aisle in the same cabin. Seat 1A was booked days in advance by Mr. Carter's party. I'm afraid we cannot make changes at this point." Evelyn's jaw clenched. Her voice dropped to a near growl. "Do you understand what it means when someone with my status gets this kind of treatment? I spend more with this airline annually than that boy's father probably paid for this seat. Do you think that's acceptable?" Jalan's voice, quiet but unwavering, cut through before the attendant could answer. "You're wrong." Evelyn's eyes snapped to him. "Excuse me," Jalan looked at her, not with aggression, but with calm clarity. "You're wrong about what my father paid, and you're wrong about who I am." The entire cabin was still. "My name is Jalan Carter," he said, voice slightly louder now, rising just enough to be heard beyond their row. "My father didn't buy this seat because he had to. He chose it for me because he believed I should see what I'm capable of, that I should learn what it means to sit with responsibility and composure." There was no tremble in his voice. No hesitation. "I didn't earn this seat with miles," he added. "I earned it with trust." Evelyn took a half step back, as if physically struck by the words. Her face flushed not just with anger now, but something dangerously close to humiliation. "You think you're better than me?" she hissed. Jalan blinked slowly. "No, ma'am, but I do believe I belong here." It wasn't arrogance. It was self-worth spoken plainly and bravely by a 15-year-old facing a storm of privilege in designer heels. The flight attendant, stunned but visibly moved, nodded once at Jalan as if to say thank you without speaking. But Evelyn's pride was a wounded animal now, and it began to lash out. She turned toward the front of the cabin and snapped her fingers sharply. "Get me the flight supervisor. I'm not speaking to anyone else." The attendant hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly, before stepping away to make the call. Evelyn turned back to Jalan, her expression darkened and eyes narrowing like she had just spotted a challenge she couldn't ignore. "You may be in that seat for now," she said, each word slow and bitter, "but let's see how long you keep it." Jalan didn't respond. He just looked out the window again, letting the fading sunlight wash over his face. He didn't need to argue, because sometimes silence was louder than any scream and stronger than any privilege stamped on a frequent flyer card. The stillness in the cabin didn't last long. Within minutes, the curtain at the front of first class rustled, and through it emerged a woman in her early 40s, hair pulled back tightly into a regulation bun. Uniform, impeccable composure, practiced to the last detail. Deborah Lane, the flight's senior supervisor, moved with a briskness that signaled authority, but her eyes scanned with calculation. She didn't approach like someone eager to resolve a misunderstanding. She approached like someone already burdened by politics. "Good evening," she said, voice level, her gaze shifting quickly between Evelyn and Jalan. "I've been informed there's a seating concern." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "It's more than a concern," she huffed. "This is a customer service failure. I've been a loyal Platinum Elite member for over 15 years, and I always sit in 1A. Always. I don't care what mistake happened today, I expect this to be corrected." Deborah listened without nodding. "I see," she said neutrally, then turned to Jalan. "And you are Mr. Carter?" "Yes, ma'am." Her voice softened slightly, but it was still coated in formality. "Mr. Carter, I understand this seat was booked under your name, is that correct?" "Yes," Jalan replied. "By my father." Deborah hesitated, not because she didn't believe him, but because she now stood on a razor's edge. One step toward Evelyn meant appeasing influence. One step toward Jalan meant respecting policy and risking Evelyn's fury. She exhaled, then gave Jalan a polite, practiced smile. "Here's the situation. Sometimes, in order to preserve the overall harmony of the cabin, we make small adjustments. Nothing personal, of course, but we were wondering if you'd be willing to switch to another seat. Still first class, just not this one." Jalan looked at her for a long second, then just like his father had taught him, he spoke calmly but firmly. "I'm afraid I can't do that," he said. "This seat wasn't just randomly assigned. My father booked it for me, specifically, and I have every right to sit in it." Deborah blinked. There was no aggression in the boy's voice, no teenage defiance, just a clear understanding of where he stood and what he stood for. Evelyn scoffed. "You're seriously letting him refuse?" Deborah turned back to her. "Mrs. Stokes, we're doing everything we can to maintain fairness." "No, you're not," Evelyn snapped. "You're letting a child dictate this flight." "That child," Jalan said softly, "has a name." The words landed with a weight that seemed to suck the breath out of the air. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," he continued, "but I won't let anyone treat me like I don't deserve to be here. I'm not moving." Deborah's face tightened. Her hand instinctively moved to the small radio clipped to her belt. She didn't use it yet, but the pressure was building. Evelyn, nearly trembling with indignation, now pointed directly at Jalan. "This is absurd. I demand immediate escalation. This is a breach of loyalty protocol. Get me someone with real authority." Deborah hesitated, and then, perhaps more out of desperation than resolve, she said, "Very well. I'll inform upper management and take the necessary steps." With that, she turned and disappeared back through the curtain, leaving Evelyn standing seething and Jalan still seated. He hadn't moved an inch. Passengers around them began to shift in their seats again, some murmuring softly, others watching more openly now. No one spoke aloud, but their expressions spoke volumes. Something serious was unfolding, and they were witnessing more than a simple disagreement. They were witnessing principle in motion. And the boy in seat 1A, he wasn't going anywhere. The minutes ticked by, slowly, tense and heavy. Every second felt like a countdown to something no one could name, but everyone could sense. Evelyn remained standing, arms crossed, her designer coat now wrinkled from agitation. She paced slightly in the aisle, muttering under her breath, her heels striking the floor like tiny hammers of discontent. Jalan sat motionless in seat 1A. The leather cushion no longer felt like comfort, it felt like duty. But he held it, not with defiance but with quiet strength. The kind his father always told him came from knowing who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise. From the rear of the cabin, hushed voices began to stir. A few heads peeked around curtains. Even business-class passengers had begun to sense something was off in the front of the plane. Word travels fast on airplanes without words. Just tension. Then the curtain at the front parted once more. But this time it wasn't a uniformed flight supervisor. Two men in dark navy suits stepped through the doorway with quiet precision. They weren't part of the flight crew, they didn't wear name tags or carry tablets. Their suits were cut too sharp, their presence too commanding. They were from corporate. Passengers immediately sensed it, straightened, in their seats, fell silent. One of the men, a tall figure with silver at his temples and a gaze like carved stone, stepped forward and spoke calmly but clearly, his voice carrying through the cabin like a subtle verdict. "My name is Robert Evans," he announced. "I'm the senior operations executive for the airline." Beside him stood a younger man, eyes scanning every face in the room, Matthew Hughes, director of in-flight compliance. Deborah Lane returned from the cockpit just as they arrived, her eyes widening slightly when she saw who was now on board. Her steps faltered, but she straightened herself quickly, attempting to maintain composure. "Mr. Evans," she greeted, forcing a polite tone. "I didn't expect such a swift response." "We were briefed," Robert said without returning the smile, "and given the nature of the report, we felt it necessary to handle this matter in person." Evelyn stepped forward eagerly. "Oh, thank goodness. Finally, someone who understands customer loyalty. You must know I'm a Platinum Elite member. I always sit in 1A. This is a terrible oversight." Robert's gaze was cool. "Professional. We've already reviewed the boarding records and seating assignments, Mrs. Stokes. Seat 1A was properly reserved under the name Jalan Carter." Evelyn opened her mouth to object, but Robert didn't give her the chance. He turned to Deborah, his voice no longer neutral. "Miss Lane, please explain to me why a valid ticket holder was being pressured to give up their seat for another passenger." Deborah's face stiffened. "I was simply trying to avoid conflict. Stokes has flown with us for years, and so you prioritized loyalty perks over documented bookings." Robert interrupted, his voice sharp, now slicing through any attempt at rationalization. Deborah flinched. "I didn't mean, but that's what happened," Robert finished. "You compromised protocol to appease privilege." He turned to Greg, the attendant who had served Evelyn earlier. "And did you step in to correct the situation?" Greg swallowed hard. I followed instructions from my supervisor." Robert exchanged a glance with Matthew, who gave a single nod. Then, facing the entire cabin, Robert spoke again. "Effective immediately, Flight Supervisor Deborah Lane and Flight Attendant Greg Thompson are relieved of duty. They will be removed from this aircraft and placed on administrative suspension pending a full investigation." A stunned hush fell over the room. Deborah's lips parted, but no words came. Greg looked stunned, as if the floor had tilted under his feet. Evelyn's expression morphed from smug victory to confusion, then panic. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "They were only trying to accommodate a loyal customer." Robert turned to her. "Mrs. Stokes, this isn't about loyalty. It's about law and ethics and respect." He glanced briefly at Jalan, whose eyes hadn't left his. "And what this young man showed today is exactly what some of our employees failed to." Deborah and Greg, now pale, were quietly escorted toward the exit by two uniformed staff members. Deborah looked back just once, her eyes meeting Evelyn's, and in that glance there was betrayal. The system she tried to uphold had just turned on her, and Evelyn, she had just realized she wasn't untouchable after all. The cabin door slid closed behind Deborah and Greg with a soft finality, but the atmosphere inside the aircraft remained taut, like stretched wire humming with silent energy. Passengers whispered in low voices, their eyes darting between Jalan and Evelyn. Some avoided looking at either. Others openly stared, as if realizing they were witnessing something far larger than a seating dispute. Evelyn remained standing in the aisle, blinking rapidly as though still processing the fact that the two crew members she had expected to act on her behalf were now gone. Expelled. Stripped of their uniforms and roles before the entire cabin. Robert Evans took a single step toward her, his voice still calm but no longer carrying the softness of diplomacy. "Mrs. Stokes, we've already reviewed your passenger profile. While we value our frequent flyers, no membership, no matter how prestigious grants, the right to override policy, displace another guest, or create disruption in the cabin." Evelyn's jaw twitched. "So this is how your airline treats loyalty, by throwing it out when it's inconvenient." Robert didn't blink. "We uphold loyalty by ensuring fairness. That's what you forgot." She scoffed, folding her arms with a defiant snap. "You think I'm the problem. He's a child." She threw a dismissive hand toward Jalin. "And you're letting him dictate how this flight goes." Jalin's head turned slightly, but he remained seated calm. Still, he didn't flinch. Matthew Hughes finally spoke, his voice quieter than Robert's, but laced with precision. "No," he said, looking at Evelyn, "we're not letting a child dictate anything. We're recognizing the basic rights of a paying customer, regardless of age." Evelyn's cheeks flushed. "You don't understand what you've done. I will contact my attorney. I'll speak to the press. I'll have your names and this entire airline smeared if you don't fix this right now." Robert's reply was quiet but devastating. "Mrs. Stokes, this is not a negotiation. This is a reckoning." She stared at him, mouth agape. Then came the final blow. Robert reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek envelope sealed in airline-branded wax. "Due to your behavior on this flight and the disruption you have caused, we are officially revoking your Platinum Elite status, effective immediately." The gasp that rippled through the cabin was nearly audible. Evelyn stumbled a half-step backward, her face going pale. You can't do that." "We already have," Matthew said, holding out a printed notification. "Your account has been suspended pending further review. All accrued benefits and priority access privileges have been rescinded." Evelyn took the paper with trembling hands, reading it as if expecting the words to change. But they didn't. Passengers watched, some in awe, some in silent agreement. A few nodded subtly in Jalin's direction. He remained still, because the truth was he didn't need Evelyn's punishment to feel vindicated. She had brought this upon herself. Robert turned once more to Jalin. "Mr. Carter," he said, voice full of something the cabin hadn't heard yet, respect. "On behalf of this airline, I sincerely apologize for the treatment you've endured today. Your conduct has been exemplary, and we are committed to ensuring that from this point forward your rights will be fully protected." Jalin nodded, once his voice even. "Thank you, sir." But across from him, Evelyn had frozen in place. The sheen of control that had once cloaked her entire presence had shattered. Her eyes darted about, scanning the cabin for sympathy, for a lifeline. But none came, only the soft, impassive stares of passengers who had seen enough. And the worst part, they weren't angry. They were disappointed. Evelyn clenched her fists at her sides, teeth gritted. "This isn't over," she muttered. But it was. It had been over the moment a 15-year-old refused to yield to intimidation and reminded everyone on board what real presence looked like. Though Evelyn's threats still echoed faintly in the air, they carried no weight anymore. Her Platinum Elite badge was no longer a shield. Her defiance now read as desperation. Even the whispers in the cabin had quieted, giving way to a collective understanding. The conflict had turned into a lesson, and the one teaching it wasn't who anyone had expected. Robert Evans stepped back, giving a subtle nod to the two uniformed security officers who had discreetly boarded just moments earlier. Their presence wasn't loud, but it was definitive. They stood behind Evelyn, hands clasped in front of them, waiting patiently but clearly ready. "Mrs. Stokes," Robert said firmly, "you have two choices. Sit down quietly in your assigned seat for the duration of the flight, or exit the aircraft now under escort. This is your final opportunity to cooperate." Evelyn's chin lifted, but her eyes betrayed her. They were wide, frantic, scanning the cabin for support, but there were no allies in sight. The man in 2D turned away, uninterested. The woman in 3A tapped her tablet screen, avoiding eye contact. Even the passengers in business class, who had started watching from behind parted curtains, showed no signs of sympathy. The room had chosen. Jalin remained still, his gaze steady, not triumphant, not smug, just resolute, calm. Evelyn glanced at him one more time, and in that look was not hatred but disbelief. As if she couldn't fathom that everything she'd believed about her importance, her privilege, her place in the world, had just unraveled at the quiet insistence of a boy who never once raised his voice. She clenched her handbag like a lifeline and with a sharp inhale stepped backward toward her assigned seat. "I'll sit," she snapped. "But don't think this is the end of it." Robert didn't respond. Neither did Matthew, and neither did Jalin, because the moment was already finished. But then, it wasn't. Evelyn took 2 slow steps down the aisle, then paused. Her shoulders rose and fell, a tremor ran through her arm, and in a move so sudden it made even the security officers jolt slightly, she spun on her heel. "This is discrimination," she shrieked. "You're humiliating me just because I stood up for my rights." Passengers flinched. The peace that had been settling over the cabin shattered again. Robert lifted his hand slightly, just enough to signal. The security officers stepped forward. Mrs. Stokes, one of them, said, calm and unshaken, "Please do not make this harder than it already is." "No," she shouted, her voice climbing higher. "You'll regret this. Everyone on this flight will hear about how you treated a loyal customer like trash." Her voice cracked. It wasn't power anymore. It was unraveling, years of entitlement collapsing under the weight of public rejection. She gestured wildly at Jalin. "And he's the one causing all of this. Not me, he's just a kid pretending to matter." The cabin froze, and then from somewhere behind Jalin, a voice rose. It was calm, middle-aged, and firm. Enough said a man seated in 2C. "You've embarrassed yourself, this crew, and this entire flight. Sit down, or leave." Another voice joined in, this time from 4A. "We just want to fly in peace. You had your say, now respect the rest of us." Evelyn turned stunned. She had expected the passengers to fear her, or at least sympathize, but instead they had turned into a wall, not loud, not hostile, just done. The lead officer moved beside her, his hand gently guiding her elbow. "This is your final warning, ma'am." Her mouth opened, but no words came, and with a shuddered breath she gave in, quietly, finally. She walked back not to seat 1A, but down the aisle toward the front door of the aircraft. She never looked back. As she passed Jalin's seat, she didn't speak. She didn't meet his eyes. But he met hers, and in that glance he didn't offer satisfaction or gloating. He offered grace. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all. The door closed behind Evelyn, and for the first time in nearly an hour, the cabin felt like an airplane again, not a courtroom. The hum of the engines returned, and so did the quiet. As the cabin door sealed behind Evelyn Stokes, a wave of invisible relief swept through the aircraft. The tension that had coiled through every seat, every breath, now began to dissolve slowly but unmistakably. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind not devastation, but clarity. The flight crew moved swiftly. A quiet announcement was made to prepare for departure. Passengers adjusted seatbelts, screens flickered back on, and for a brief moment there was a stillness that felt sacred, like the sky had paused to let dignity catch its breath. Jalin Carter, still in seat 1A, leaned back slightly, the leather cradling him, not like a throne, but like home. He hadn't moved, not when he was told he didn't belong. Not when status tried to bulldoze truth. Not even when silence seemed easier. And now his silence had done more than win him the seat. It had transformed it, from a status symbol into a symbol of self-worth. Across the aisle, a woman in her 60s leaned forward slightly and offered a soft nod in his direction. No words, just recognition, and a kind of admiration that didn't need to be spoken to be heard. Jalin offered a faint smile in return, a quiet moment of human connection, one that carried more weight than any press release. From the back of the cabin, a young attendant approached. She looked nervous at first, but when she reached him, her posture straightened and her voice steadied. "Mr. Carter," she said, "on behalf of our crew, I just want to say thank you. You handled everything with such grace. We'll make sure you're taken care of for the rest of the flight." He nodded. "Thank you," he replied, and meant it. But in his mind, he wasn't thinking about the juice or the seat, or even the drama that had unfolded. He was thinking about the call he knew he needed to make. He pulled out his phone, tapped a familiar name and waited. It only rang once. Jalan came the deep voice on the other end. Calm, steady, reassuring. "Hi, Dad," Jalan said, his voice low. There was a pause, not of doubt, but of listening. "I didn't move," Jalan added. "I stayed in my seat." He heard the breath on the other end, the kind of breath that wasn't just relief, but pride wrapped in stillness. "You did the right thing," Marcus Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "You didn't let them shrink you." Jalan closed his eyes. The engines were warming now. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane prepared for taxi. And the voice of the captain came over the intercom, smooth and professional, announcing departure procedures. But all Jalan could focus on was the voice in his ear, his father's voice reminding him that sometimes courage didn't look like raising your fist. Sometimes it looked like staying seated, especially when the world tells you to stand down. "I'm proud of you," Marcus said, "not just because you stayed, but because you stayed right." Jalan didn't say much after that. He didn't need to. He simply whispered, "Thank you, Dad." They ended the call, and as the wheels began to roll forward, pushing the aircraft toward the runway, Jalan looked out the window. The sky was still open. The journey had only just begun. And somehow, even without leaving the ground yet, he had already gone further than most people ever do. He had faced power. He had held his peace. And he had proved without shouting, without pushing, without privilege, that he belonged exactly where he was. The aircraft ascended steadily into the sky, the city lights below shrinking into a glittering web of distant memories. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted completely. Gone was the heavy cloud of conflict, replaced by the quiet hum of flight, the soft rustle of blankets being unfolded, and the clink of glasses as beverages were served once again. Jalan watched the clouds pass beneath the wing through the window of seat 1A, his reflection faintly visible in the curved glass. The rhythm of the engines beneath him, the smoothness of the takeoff, it should have been just another flight. But it wasn't. Not anymore. He hadn't expected to become the center of anything that day. He was just a kid on his first solo trip, proud to be trusted by his father with a small symbol of maturity. That seat wasn't about leather or legroom. It was about the space he had been taught he deserved. And he had defended it. Not with volume, but with value. A soft knock on the wall near his seat pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find Robert Evans once more, now without the formal edge. His tie had been loosened slightly, his eyes softer than before. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" Robert asked. Jalan shook his head. "Of course not." The man took the seat beside him, temporarily, hands clasped in front of him. "I've been with this airline for over 2 decades, Robert began, voice low enough not to carry. "I've seen a lot. Rude passengers, mistakes in booking, even full-blown mid-air meltdowns. But I've never seen someone your age, hell any age, handle themselves the way you did today." Jalan looked down, almost embarrassed by the praise. "You didn't shout, you didn't retaliate. You didn't crumble under the weight of someone else's entitlement," Robert continued. "You just held your ground, and that changed everything." Jalan looked back out the window for a second. "I didn't feel strong. I was scared. Angry even. But I just kept thinking, if I give up this seat now, it won't stop here. It never stops at one seat." Robert nodded, a thoughtful smile touching his lips. "It never does." He reached into his pocket and handed Jalan a small envelope, simple white with no logos or branding. "Just a token of gratitude," he said. "And a commitment." Jalan opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "To Jalan Carter, this flight reminded us who we should be. And you reminded us what we should never forget. Thank you for teaching us more than we ever expected to learn today." Beneath the note were 2 small cards, one a lifetime voucher for complimentary upgrades with the airline, and the other a formal letter confirming that his complaint had led to the creation of a new internal training initiative centered on respect, equity, and inclusion. Jalan didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, his throat too tight to respond. Robert stood and gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Rest easy, Mr. Carter. The seat was always yours." And with that he returned to the front of the cabin, leaving Jalan alone again, with his thoughts and the stars now blinking outside his window. For the first time since boarding, Jalan let his eyes close, not from fatigue, but from release. He had nothing to prove anymore. Because the sky had already listened, and it had lifted him higher than he ever thought he could go. By the time the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the drama from earlier felt like a distant ripple across an otherwise calm sea. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft glow. Passengers were quietly watching films, sipping drinks, or napping beneath fleece blankets. But Jalan remained awake, not because he was restless, but because the weight of what had happened, what he had stood up for, still pulsed gently in his chest like a quiet echo. He had been tested in a way no 15-year-old expected to be, and while he had come through it with grace, the gravity of it hadn't disappeared with Evelyn's exit. He replayed every moment in his head, wondering how close he'd come to giving in. There had been that pause when the flight supervisor looked him in the eye, asking for just a gesture of flexibility. When the cabin eyes were on him, some doubtful, some indifferent, when it might have felt easier to just stand up and move to shrink. But he didn't, and now even with the hush of the airplane surrounding him, Jalan didn't feel like a passenger anymore. He felt like a participant in something larger. Across the aisle, the same elderly woman who had nodded earlier now gently leaned over again. "I hope you don't mind," she whispered, "but I just wanted to say something." Jalan turned to her, alert but respectful. "I've flown more than you can imagine, young man," she said softly, her voice delicate but sure, "and I've seen people lose their minds over peanuts and pillows. But what you did today, that wasn't about a seat." Jalan tilted his head. "No, ma'am, it wasn't." She smiled. "You reminded people that dignity doesn't come with a price tag." He smiled back, small, grateful. She leaned back into her seat without another word. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't applause. It was something better, quiet solidarity. As the flight continued, one of the attendants approached again, this time with a tray holding a small silver pin shaped like a pair of wings. "We give these to first-time solo flyers," she said warmly. "But in your case, I think it means a little more." Jalan accepted it, running his fingers across the delicate design. It sparkled faintly in the overhead light. The wings weren't just symbolic of flight anymore. They were symbols of something deeper. By standing his ground, he had elevated the expectations of every person on board. He had refused to be less than what he was, even when power tried to silence him. The rest of the flight passed in gentle stillness. He watched the stars, the clouds, the slow drift of the night sky. And somewhere over the vast black ocean below, Jalan Carter leaned back in seat 1A, clipped the wings to his shirt pocket, and smiled faintly to himself. Not because he'd won, but because he'd endured without bitterness, without anger, and without leaving his seat. The boy who had been told he didn't belong had reminded them all that belonging isn't something others grant you. It's something you carry. And in that truth, he found rest. When the plane touched down on the tarmac at San Francisco International, the wheels kissed the runway with a gentle thud, and the cabin let out a collective breath, a mix of relief, routine, and quiet closure. The familiar ding of the seatbelt sign went off, followed by the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. But Jalan didn't move. He sat still for a moment, staring out the window at the blinking lights that lined the taxiway. A city waited outside, but for him something else had arrived, a quiet transformation. Across from him, a man in a charcoal blazer gave him a brief, respectful nod as he stood to retrieve his briefcase. Others glanced his way, not with pity or discomfort, but with something new, recognition. Not of his last name, not of his father's reputation, but of him. The boy who hadn't moved. The boy who taught the plane what integrity looked like when status tried to redefine it. As passengers filed out, a few murmured kind words. "You held yourself well. Wish my son had half your courage. You taught us all something today, kid." Jalan nodded to each, his voice soft, his responses humble. He didn't seek their praise. He accepted it as acknowledgement of something shared, something unspoken that had shifted in the air long before the plane had touched ground. By the time the cabin had emptied, only the cleaning crew waited at the gate, and Robert Evans returned for a final word. "I spoke with your father," he said. "He wanted to make sure you got to your hotel safely. There'll be a private car waiting outside the terminal." Jalan nodded. "Thanks. And thank you for everything earlier." Robert offered a rare smile. "You made our job easier today, not because of what happened, but because of how you responded. We've already initiated a review across our frontline policies. Evelyn Stokes won't be our only case study. You're changing more than you realize." Jalan tilted his head slightly. I wasn't trying to change anything. I was just trying to stay in my seat. That's exactly why it matters. As Jalan stood to gather his bag, Robert added one last thing. We've had dozens of internal meetings about loyalty upgrades and status, but none of those conversations ever moved us like this flight did. Jalan slung his backpack over one shoulder, glancing down at the seat he had just occupied for 5 quiet, defining hours. From the outside, it had looked like just another flight. But to him and to everyone who witnessed it, it had become something much more, a declaration. That your worth isn't determined by your age, your skin, your wealth, or your frequent flyer tier. It's determined by your courage to remain seated when pressure tells you to get out of the way. As Jalan stepped through the cabin door into the jet bridge, the cool air rushed in to meet him. He paused for just a second, looked back once, not at the plane, but at that singular leather seat. Seat 1A. And he walked forward into the night. Not as a passenger, but as a young man who now knew exactly who he was and how far that truth could carry him. In the days that followed, what had happened on flight AC-709 became more than a memory. It became a movement. At first, it was whispers, rumors, traded between frequent flyers, crew members, and airport lounges. But then the story began to spread. Someone had taken a video. Not of the entire incident, but of the moment Evelyn was escorted off the plane. Of Jalan sitting calmly in 1A as it all unfolded. It wasn't long before the clip made its way online. The video wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic outbursts, no theatrical confrontations. Just a quiet boy in a navy sweater sitting silently while the world tried and failed to dislodge him. And in that stillness, people found something rare, a reflection of dignity. Within 24 hours, hashtags began to trend. Seat 1A, Jalan Carter, how strength in stillness, social media platforms lit up with debates, praise and stories from people who had experienced similar moments of quiet defiance. Teachers shared the clip with their students. Parents watched it with their children. Corporate executives passed it through email threads with subject lines like, "Watch this, then rethink our policies." The airline, to its credit, didn't hide. They leaned in. Within a week, a formal statement was released across all media platforms. The events on flight AC-709 were a wake-up call, not just for our company, but for our industry. We recognize the pain caused by inaction, and we commend Mr. Jalan Carter for his remarkable composure and courage. As of today, our airline will be implementing mandatory training focused on implicit bias, customer dignity, and the importance of protecting every passenger's rights, regardless of age, race, or perceived status. We thank Mr. Carter for reminding us who we must strive to be. The message was met with applause, and something more rare, trust. But Jalan didn't care much for headlines. At home, his father sat beside him on the living room couch, flipping through news clips and articles as if studying his own son for the first time in a new light. "Are you okay with all this attention?" Marcus asked. Jalan shrugged. "It's a little weird," his father chuckled. "That's fair. But I want you to know something." He turned to Jalan, his voice low but grounded. "You didn't just keep your seat, son. You gave others permission to claim theirs." Jalan absorbed the words slowly, then nodded. He didn't need applause. He didn't need the world to remember his name. But if his story made it just a little easier for the next kid to sit where they belonged without apology, then maybe that was enough. And across the country, in boardrooms and classrooms and households, people were listening. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't begin with protests or parades. Sometimes they begin with someone who simply refuses to move. Weeks passed. The world moved on as it always does. The story of flight AC-709 eventually faded from trending tabs and news cycles. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, and for those who had truly listened, something lingered. It wasn't just about what had happened on that plane. It was about what it revealed. At Jalan's school, teachers began including discussions about dignity and resilience in their classrooms. One history instructor began his civil rights unit by showing the video of Jalan in seat 1A, followed by a single question: "What does resistance look like in your generation?" The room was silent for nearly a minute, and then one girl raised her hand and said, "It looks like him." In airports across the country, subtle shifts began to appear. Crew members receiving new training on conflict mediation and unconscious bias. a small plaque installed in the staff area of that same aircraft that read, "Respect begins with the seat you protect." Even the airline's internal staff memo shared a bold line, "If Jalan Carter had moved, none of us would have." But for Jalan himself, life settled into something like normal again, though not quite. He returned to the rhythm of school projects and late-night conversations with his father. But he was different, not louder, not prouder, just more certain of his voice, of his presence, of his place in the world. One evening, Marcus walked into Jalan's room holding a thin envelope. "Something came in the mail for you." Jalan opened it and found a letter with a gold seal at the top. The National Civil Rights Education Committee. "Dear Mr. Carter, your actions aboard Flight AC-709 were not only commendable, they were deeply instructive. In a time when decency can be overshadowed by dominance, you reminded us that courage often looks like composure. We'd be honored to feature your story in our new youth leadership exhibit titled Quiet Power." And Chine was an invitation to speak just briefly at the exhibit's opening. A 5-minute reflection, nothing formal, nothing grand. Jalan showed it to his dad without a word. Marcus smiled. "Only if you want to." Jalan folded the letter and nodded. "Yeah, I think I do." Not because he wanted the attention, but because he now understood something vital. His story didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to every kid who had ever felt small in a big room. Every passenger who had ever been asked to shrink so someone else could stretch. Every person who had ever been told to move, not because they were wrong, but because someone else couldn't accept them being right. And maybe, just maybe, if someone like him told the story, then someone like Evelyn wouldn't be able to write the ending next time. Because the truth about power, it changes hands the moment you decide to keep your seat. The event at the National Civil Rights Education Committee wasn't large, nor was it flashy. It wasn't broadcast live or splashed across cable news. But the room was full. Dozens of students, educators, advocates and families sat in quiet attention beneath soft lighting and a series of banners that read, "Quiet Power, when presence speaks louder than privilege." Jalan stood backstage holding the folded note he had scribbled the night before. His hands weren't trembling, but his breath was slower than usual. He didn't fear speaking. He just understood the weight of this moment, not as a spotlight, but as stewardship. Marcus stood beside him, hands in his pockets, dressed plainly but proud. "Say what you need," he whispered, "and only what feels true." Jalan nodded. When his name was called, there was polite applause. Nothing roaring, just warm. He stepped up to the small wooden lectern, adjusted the mic, and looked out not over strangers but faces. Curious ones, some hopeful, some skeptical, many young. He cleared his throat. "I didn't expect to be here," he began. "I didn't expect to become a story. I just wanted to fly." A small chuckle rippled through the audience. "I was taught to listen, to stay polite, to avoid causing problems. But I was also taught something else, something deeper." He paused, unfolding the note slowly. "My father told me once that life will put you in rooms where people expect you to shrink, and that if I ever felt pressure to move for someone who didn't respect my presence, I shouldn't stand up." He looked around the room. "I should stay seated." A hush fell over the crowd. "Seat 1A didn't make me important," Jalan said, "but knowing I deserved to be there, that did. And when someone tried to take that away because I didn't look like what they expected, I remembered who gave me that seat, and why." He folded the note, no longer needing it. "I didn't speak out to be brave. I spoke out because I couldn't carry silence anymore. And I stayed seated, not to defy someone else's comfort, but to protect my own worth." A girl near the front wiped her cheek. "I'm not the only one this has happened to, and I won't be the last. But maybe if we tell these stories, if we remind each other we're allowed to hold our ground even in small ways, we can make it easier for the next person." He paused, then smiled slightly. Because sometimes courage isn't about making noise. It's about not budging when the noise comes for you. A long silence followed. Then the audience rose quietly in unison. Not a standing ovation in the traditional sense, but something closer to reverence. Jalan stepped away from the microphone, returning to the side of the stage where Marcus waited. His father didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes, shining but steady, said everything. "You didn't just sit still, son. You made the world stand up." Months later, the world had moved on. But the story of Seat 1A had quietly etched itself into more places than Jalan could have imagined. A few classrooms, a few boardrooms, a few changed minds. He had returned to his everyday life. Homework, quiet bus rides, the familiar rhythm of adolescence. He didn't walk through the halls with a hero's swagger, just the calm confidence of someone who had been tested and stood through it. But every now and then someone would stop him in the hallway. "I saw that video," they'd whisper. "You gave me a lot to think about," a teacher would say. And one evening, while waiting at the gate for another flight, this time with his father again by his side, a young flight attendant approached shyly. "Are you the Jalan Carter from the flight?" Jalan nodded, unsure what to say. She smiled. "They showed your story during our orientation. They said, protect every seat, because behind every one is someone's dignity." That night, Jalan looked out the window again as the plane took off, not from Seat 1A, but from somewhere near the wing. He didn't need the position to remind him of his worth anymore. The lesson had landed. Because standing up for yourself doesn't always require standing. Sometimes it simply requires staying. And when you do, the world begins to adjust not to your noise, but to your presence. What Jalan Carter did that day wasn't extraordinary because it was dramatic. It was extraordinary because it was deliberate. It wasn't the confrontation that made the moment historic. It was the calm refusal, the quiet resistance, the belief that he was enough even when the world insisted he wasn't. You see, power doesn't always announce itself with shouting or flashing lights. Sometimes it looks like a 15-year-old boy sitting still while injustice storms around him. Sometimes it's knowing you belong even when no one else in the room wants to believe it. So we leave you with this: what is your seat? Who or what has tried to push you out of it? And when the pressure comes, will you rise too fast? Or will you stay grounded in who you are? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, please like, share, subscribe to Century Stories, where everyday voices prove that quiet strength is louder than any privilege. Until next time, hold your seat, hold your ground, and never apologize for belonging.